We left off in the last segment talking about the grammatical historical method, and we had some definitions from Britannica.com. And now I want to go ahead and start listing the guidelines involved in this method. Now, depending on which author you're reading or who you're talking to, these various principles might be listed in a different order or articulated slightly differently. But the order that I would like to get today, that we would articulate ourselves here, is the following list. First of all, harmony and unity. Second of all, grammar. Third, historical context. Fourth, progressive revelation. Fifth, context. Sixth, the priority of clarity. And seven, various sub-rules or sub-guidelines concerning the issue of prophecy. Now, on a historic level, it's important to note that this point of view has been around for a very long time. It's not a new approach that's been developed, although it has had various revivals over time as it's fell in and out of favor, competing particularly with allegory or more reader response, I should say, focused hermeneutical approaches. And so let's sort of bolster that understanding of history just a little bit. Again, we're going to turn to Britannica, and they write that Jerome, an influential 4th century biblical scholar, championed the literal interpretation of the Bible in opposition to what he regarded as the excesses of allegorical interpretation. The primacy of the literal sense was later advocated by such diverse figures as Thomas Aquinas, John Colet, Martin Luther, and John Calvin. So not only major Catholic figures, Roman Catholic figures like Thomas Aquinas, but also Reformation figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, as well as very early figures like Jerome in the 4th century. So this set of rules has been around for a long time. And as I said, it was articulated slightly differently by various authors, but they essentially all agreed to the points that we've articulated in those list of 7 guidelines. And so this is nothing new. This isn't something that we've come up with ourselves or something that modern theologians have come up with. It's been around for a while. So let's talk about these individual components. The first being harmony and unity. Essentially, this is the law of non-contradiction as applied to Scripture. And we'll let a couple of other authors define it for us. Again, Gary DeLashmutt and Dennis McCallum in their article Grammatical Historical Hermeneutics on Xenos.org states, interpret Scripture in harmony with other Scripture. Since the Bible is inspired by God, it does not contradict itself. Therefore, never interpret Scripture in such a way that it clearly contradicts other Scriptures. Speaking similarly, Wikipedia states, if it is axiomatic that the canon of Scripture must be an organic whole, then an interpretation that contradicts any other part of Scripture is not considered to be sound. Essentially, the idea here is that if you have, even in the case of a human author, they say one thing and then a little bit later they contradict themselves. Not only do you don't know which of those 2 statements is true because they contradict themselves, but you don't necessarily know that the author is accurate in either case because they're self-contradicting. So it's possible that they're entirely wrong. The same is true concerning Scripture, especially since from a Christian point of view we look at God as the author of Scripture. So not only do we not want to have this single author, God, contradicting himself in various points in time, but because he's God, he's by definition infallible, so he can't be contradicting himself on that level either. And consequently, when we approach Scripture, we have to assume that all the passages of Scripture, through one way or another, have to reconcile with each other, either because they're under different covenants and there's changes in the covenants, or some other explanation, but they have to be reconciled. You can't simply take one passage and ignore it because it violates or disagrees with your particular point of view. You have to reconcile that with the passages that seem to support your point of view to come up with a whole picture that reconciles all of the text of Scripture. And that's what's summarized here in this principle of harmony and unity, essentially the law of non-contradiction. Second of all, grammar. Grammar and history have been the 2 principles that define this hermeneutical method. And so we're going to talk a little bit about grammar. In his book, Henry Virkler states, the lexical syntactical analysis develops an understanding of the definitions of words and their relationship to one another, or syntax, or also grammar, in order to understand more accurately the meaning the author intended to convey. Xenos.org again states, we begin by taking what we can determine as the normal, everyday meaning of the words, phrases, and sentences to the extent possible. In other words, our interpretation must correspond to the words and grammar in the text in a reasonable way. So this is very straightforward. Grammar, you look at what part of the sentence a particular word is. Is it the subject? Is it the verb? Is it the object? Who's receiving what action? Who's doing what action? What adjectives are describing that? And the tense of the verb, how the verb is conjugated, past, present, future, what mood it's in. Those types of things are the primary way that we see an author's intent expressed and captured for us, and we have to give consideration to that. We can't ignore it. Second, historical context. Again, Henry Virkler writes, historical cultural analysis considers the historical cultural milieu or context in which an author wrote in order to understand allusions, references, and purposes of the author. Zenos.org states, similarly, historical interpretation means that we take into account the historical background of the author and the recipients as much as possible. The Bible was written to common people and is understandable to anyone. However, it was written thousands of years ago to a different culture. And that's an essential point. Even though the Bible was written to common man, and it was written so that we would understand it centuries later, it wasn't written directly to us. It was written to people of a different culture and time. They conclude here that as modern readers, we have to try to recover a general sense of the meaning of words, phrases, and concepts in the ancient cultures. And I think that is absolutely true. The next point here is progressive revelation. That's the next guideline or principle. It's really sort of an expansion of one aspect of the historical context. And we'll let a couple of these authors define it for us and talk about it a little. Henry Virkler states that theological analysis studies the level of theological understanding at the time a revelation is given, in order to ascertain the meaning of the original text for its original recipient. So theological understanding at the time a revelation was written. What was the understanding when Daniel wrote his book? What was the understanding already in existence when the psalmist wrote, or when Moses received the revelation from God on the Mount? What was the understanding of the Israelites prior to that at that time? That's essentially what's being described here. Zenos.org says, interpret in light of progressive revelation. While God's purpose for man has never changed, his strategy in accomplishing that purpose has changed. He has dealt with man under different covenants or programs. Therefore, it is important to ask, under which program was this written? The primary application of the passage will be the people operating under that program or covenant, not necessarily to others. And that's important because when we approach Scripture saying, what does it mean to me, as a primary question, we're ignoring the fact that it wasn't written primarily to us. It was written under different covenants at different points in time, and God was trying to communicate to someone else first and only to us secondarily. Connected with this is something called the law of first reference. And essentially what this states is that Scripture does often define a concept or term the first time that it mentions it. And more generally what this is saying is, if you're reading in a later book of the Bible or a later passage and you see a term that's unfamiliar to you, that may not be defined in the text of that later passage, because the author might be assuming that you're familiar with all the previous passages that talk about that topic and that you bring that context with you into this later passage. And therefore you might approach a text, read about a term or topic, it's not defined well for you in the text, and if you're not aware of this trend, you may insert your own ideas into a passage that doesn't define the topic for you. Instead, what you need to do is go back in all the previous places the Scriptures talked about this, build your understanding from the earliest to the latest, and bring those earlier references, those first references, into the picture when you form your definitions of those later texts. So let's look at the earliest time that Scripture mentions things, build our definitions accordingly as Scripture moves forward to talk about those topics over time. The next point here is context. Context, essentially, as Henry Virkler describes it, it considers the relationship of a given passage to the whole body of the author's writing. Zenos.org says, interpret in light of the context of the passage, follow the thoughts developed in the book you are reading, and make sure your interpretation flows along with the general direction of the argument. Consider the larger context as well, which testament, which author, which time period. Never view a passage in isolation from its surroundings. The context should be considered the most important kind of evidence in the interpretation, and anyone who claims to see a break in context bears the full burden of proof. Essentially, context works from the inside out. You start with the verse itself, you look at the sentences around it, the paragraph, the chapter that it's in, as well as the book it's in, if it's in Corinthians or Ephesians or one of the Gospels or one of the Old Testament books. And then you look at the context of the entire Testament that it's in, and then the whole Bible, of course. And so you're harmonizing. Essentially, this is an extension of the principle of harmony. You're assuming that the meaning is consistent over time, it makes sense in its context, and therefore you're reconciling any particular verse with the surroundings that it finds itself in. And that's how this works. Context, you look at context.